Spring arrived late in Aspen, Colorado, in 1951, not with the bloom of fresh beginnings, but with a lingering cold that settled between the mountains like an echo of something unresolved. The air still smelled of melting snow, pine, and the exhaust of the tourists' cars that came crawling in for the season. People in search of peace and powder, unaware that some of us had buried too many things to ever fully enjoy either. I had come to this quiet, pine-shadowed town, not for the skiing or the views, but because it felt like a place where a man could disappear, where his silence wouldn't draw questions, and where the past might stay buried if he was careful enough not to speak of it, not even to himself. I took a job at a local auto shop near the edge of town. Nothing glamorous, just the kind of honest, greasy work that left your hands too busy and too filthy to dwell on memory. I rented a small room above the garage, kept to myself, paid cash, and told the locals my name was John. No last name unless someone pressed, and even then I'd offer a different one each time. They never noticed. Or maybe they did, but in small towns, kindness sometimes looks like pretending not to notice a man's unease. The truth was that I didn't fear being caught by the government or hunted by enemies. No, what I feared most was being recognized by someone who remembered who I used to be, someone who could look into my eyes and say that name I had buried alongside all the promises I'd failed to keep. I didn't want to be remembered, not as a soldier, not as a hero, and certainly not as the man who left Anna behind. I wore an old army coat, the same one I'd brought back from Europe, and in its lining, stitched into the very fabric where no one could see it, I kept the medal they gave me in Prague, a medal that I neither asked for nor felt worthy of, handed to me by a dying commander in the middle of rubble and smoke, a final gesture in a war that had already taken more from us than we ever admitted. I kept it not out of pride, but as proof to myself that I had survived, though sometimes I wondered if that was something I should be proud of. Then one afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to drop behind the ridgelines, casting long, solemn shadows across the town, I bent down to help an elderly woman who had dropped her grocery bag in the parking lot outside the shop. My coat fell open as I crouched, and before I could gather the bag or even notice, the medal slipped out, tumbling onto the pavement with a soft metallic clink that echoed louder than any gunshot I'd ever heard. The woman froze, and then, with a voice cracking under the weight of disbelief, she looked at me and cried out, "John? John Harris? Oh my God, is it really you?" Her voice cut straight through me, not just the name, but the familiarity behind it, the kind of recognition you never expect to survive long enough to hear. Because she wasn't just anyone, she was Mary, Anna's sister, the woman who once smiled knowingly as Anna placed a lavender ribbon in my hand before I boarded the train for Europe, the woman who had every reason to hate me. And there it was, the name I had spent years trying to hide, now echoing off the mountains like a wound torn open again. If this story is already touching you the way it moved me to write it, hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that inspire, surprise, and stay with you. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. After the war, I didn't come home looking for parades or praise. I came back looking for silence, for space, for the chance to be left alone in a world that no longer made room for the man I had become. There were no victory banners waiting for me at the train station, no tearful embraces on the platform, no one calling my name, which was exactly how I wanted it. When I arrived in Aspen in the early fall of 1948, I told people I was just another mechanic drifting west. I told them I didn't have family, that I'd served like many others, but didn't like to talk about it. People here didn't ask many questions, and I learned fast to never offer more than was required. I lived in a small room above the garage, just a cot and a desk, with a little window that looked out toward the mountains, those massive, indifferent ridges that made a man feel smaller than his past. I worked 6 days a week, kept my head down, and made enough money to eat, to pay rent, and to buy the occasional bottle that helped me forget. I told myself it was a life, not the one I dreamed of, but a life And after everything I'd done, everything I'd left behind, it felt like more than I deserved. No one in Aspen knew who I had been before the war. Not my full name, not the woman I loved, not the things I'd seen or done in the shattered streets of Europe. And I guarded that silence like a soldier guards the final perimeter, not because I feared consequences, but because I couldn't bear the weight of recognition. I didn't want anyone to say my name and remember the boy who left in 1944, all filled with promises and purpose. Because the man who came back in 1946 had nothing left to give, not to her, not to anyone. The truth is, I spent those years hiding not from the government, not from enemies overseas, but from the possibility that someone might look at me and remember the parts of me I couldn't face. I feared the accidental encounter more than any ambush I'd known in combat, the kind where someone stops you on the street, their eyes squinting, and they say, "Aren't you?" That's the kind of question that can undo you. I kept the medal hidden in the lining of my coat, not out of shame, though perhaps shame played its part, but because it felt like a relic from a version of me that no longer existed. It was awarded in the ruins of Prague by a captain who bled out beside me before he could finish his last sentence. They pinned it on me with trembling hands and called it bravery, but all I had done was survive, and there's no real honor in surviving when others don't. In the shop, I kept my head under hoods and behind engines. The smell of grease and gasoline was familiar, grounding. Customers didn't care about my past. They wanted their carburetors cleaned, their belts replaced. I liked that. The predictability, the safety in routine. I learned to listen more than speak, to nod without saying much, to stay vague about where I came from and when I got there. Aspen, like any town, had its talkers, but it also had its ghosts, and I became one of them. Every so often I'd hear the name Harris in the news, a general, a senator, some distant cousin of history, and I'd flinch. Even though I had changed my story so often, I could barely remember which version I'd last told. But no one ever pressed, and I convinced myself that the past would stay buried if I just never gave it a reason to rise. But the memory of Anna was the one thing I could never bury, her voice, her laughter, the lavender ribbon she tied around my wrist before I left, not just a token of love, but a vow sealed in silence. She told me, "Bring this back to me, so I know you're still mine." I'd kept that ribbon, folded tight inside a matchbox, wrapped in cloth and stashed in the bottom of my drawer. Every year when spring returned, I'd take it out, hold it for a moment, then tuck it away again. It was the only part of my old life I allowed to survive. I told myself I left Anna behind to protect her from the man I'd become, from the burden of loving a soldier who might never come home. I told myself she was better off with someone who could promise her a future. But the truth is, I was afraid of what she would see in my eyes when I came back. Afraid that her love couldn't reach the places I had been. So I never went back, not to her, not to anyone. Then came that afternoon, the one I never saw coming. When the medal slipped out of my coat like a whisper-turned-scream, and the woman who picked up her groceries from the pavement looked me straight in the eye and said the name I hadn't heard in years. She didn't ask if it was me. She knew. She was Anna's sister, and in her eyes I saw everything I had tried to forget. When Mary called out my name, not the one I use now, but the one I had buried, it wasn't just the shock of being recognized that stopped me cold, but the way she said it with a kind of trembling reverence, as if she'd seen a ghost walk out of the smoke of war and into the light of an ordinary afternoon. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, and hearing it now on her lips brought with it a rush of memory so vivid that it felt as if I had been ripped out of the present and thrown backwards in time, to a train station in Kansas, 1944, when Anna's fingers had brushed my wrist and tied a small lavender ribbon around it, whispering, "So you don't forget who loves you." It wasn't meant as a charm or superstition. She was never sentimental like that. It was her way of anchoring me to something solid, something pure, before I boarded that train in my uniform and disappeared into the grey machinery of war. That ribbon stayed with me through every station, every rain-soaked march, every city in ruins. I wore it tucked inside my helmet lining or in the breast pocket of my jacket until the fabric wore thin and the scent of lavender faded into dust. And yet I kept it, not because I believed it would bring me home, but because it was the last piece of her I dared to carry. Now, decades later, standing on a sidewalk in Colorado, with Mary staring at me like I'd been resurrected from the dead, all of that came rushing back, not in snapshots or single images, but in a flood. The farmhouse where Anna grew up, the summer nights on the porch, when the crickets sang and we dreamed about the future like fools, the way her laughter lit up even the most ordinary moments. And that morning, the morning I left, when her voice broke just slightly as she said, "Come back whole, come back to me," I never did. When Mary finally spoke again, her voice was smaller, as if carrying too much weight for one afternoon. "We thought you died in France." I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight, as though a noose of memory had closed around it. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. Because she wasn't wrong. A part of me had died out there. Maybe the better part. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the medal where it now lay exposed on the front of my coat, its metal still catching the last rays of sunlight like some cursed relic. Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. "No, Anna never stopped waiting," she whispered. And that was the blow I hadn't braced for, because I had told myself for years that she'd moved on, that she'd found someone else, that my silence had freed her. But Mary's words pulled the rug from beneath that lie, revealing instead a woman who had spent seasons in hope and heartbreak, writing letters that never reached me, mourning a man who hadn't had the decency to die, but simply vanished. We walked together, me in silence, her speaking only when the weight of it all became too much to keep inside, until we reached the old house on Maple Street, where the clapboard siding still bore the same faded white paint, and the porch swing creaked with the rhythm of ghosts. She unlocked the door without ceremony and led me inside to a room that hadn't changed much since the war. Same wallpaper, same scent of lemon oil and old paper. On the mantel above the fireplace stood framed photographs. Anna as a girl, Anna in her nursing uniform, Anna with another man, tall, respectable-looking with a hand on her shoulder. And beside that photo, one of a boy, maybe 5 years old. I felt something shift inside me. A slow, uncertain cracking of something I hadn't known was still intact. "That's her son," Mary said, watching me closely. "His name is Caleb." The name hit me harder than I expected. I studied the boy's face, the eyes, the set of the mouth, something in the tilt of his head. Not a mirror, but a whisper of something familiar. I didn't ask the question. I didn't have to. Mary nodded anyway. He was born in 46. She never talked about who the father was, but we all knew. I sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how heavy my legs felt, how fast my heart was beating. It was too much to process too fast. A son, my son. A child I never met, a lifetime lost in the space between a missed letter and a coward's silence. Mary left me alone in the room. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that photograph, feeling the years pour over me like cold rain. When she returned, she carried a small box, wooden, worn, and set it gently on the table beside me. "She kept these," she said softly. "Letters, all the ones she sent and got back. And the ones she never mailed. You should read them." I opened the lid with hands I barely recognized as mine. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each addressed in her handwriting. Some were unopened, marked "Returned to Sender" in red. Others had been carefully resealed. There were notes, sketches, scraps of poetry. Her voice, her real unfiltered voice, whispering through ink across time. The scent of lavender rose faintly from the paper. That night, I didn't go back to my room above the garage. I stayed at the house in the old guest room, reading by lamplight until dawn. Each letter peeled back another layer of guilt and grief until there was nothing left but the man I had become, raw, humbled, terrified. And somewhere in the middle of those pages, I found a single sentence that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "I don't need him to be a hero. I just want him to come home." I spent most of the following day alone in Anna's childhood home, surrounded by the kind of silence that doesn't comfort but tightens. The kind that creeps under the skin, into the chest, into the hollow places you thought were long since sealed. Mary had gone out early, giving me space, perhaps sensing that what I needed wasn't company, but permission to sit with the damage. I wandered the rooms like a man sifting through the wreckage of a house he once built with his own hands, only to return and find it burned to the ground by time. In the small parlor, where lace curtains swayed softly with each passing breeze, I stared at the photos on the mantel again, fixating on the one of the boy, Caleb, my son. I hadn't said it out loud yet, but the truth had already settled in my bones like winter. There was no use denying it. He had Anna's eyes, yes, but the way his brows pulled together, the way he stood with one shoulder higher than the other, those were mine. I saw in his expression not just a child's innocence, but a reflection of everything I had left behind. I ran my fingers along the edge of the table where we'd once played cards before Sunday supper, where Anna had laughed so freely that I had once imagined, foolishly, that war would never find us. I thought back to the promise I made her the night before I left. "I'll come back to you, no matter what." I had said it with the conviction of a man who had not yet seen what the world was capable of. And I had broken it in silence, 1 year at a time, each letter I failed to send, each train I didn't take back home, each new town I passed through pretending that love could be left in the past like a jacket or a name. When Mary returned, she found me still sitting by the window, the lavender ribbon spread across my lap like a confession. She didn't speak at first. She just poured us both a cup of coffee and handed me another envelope, one she had kept separate from the others. "She wrote this one last," she said, "but she never mailed it." I unfolded the paper with trembling hands and read slowly, as if every word might vanish before I reached the next. In it, Anna spoke not of blame or bitterness, but of memory, of the way I once held her hand at the county fair, of how she still imagined me walking beside her when the wind blew through the wheat fields. She didn't ask me why I hadn't come back. She didn't ask for explanations. What she wrote instead were the words I had feared and longed for in equal measure. "If you're still alive, I hope you're safe, and if you ever come back, I hope you let yourself be seen again." That sentence split me open in a way the war never had, because it wasn't just forgiveness, it was something deeper, something closer to grace. She had let go of anger long before I even understood what I'd lost. Mary waited until I finished reading before she told me the rest. After the letters stopped coming back, she stopped writing them, but she didn't stop waiting. She raised Caleb as best she could. Her husband, the one she married, was a decent man, but he wasn't you, and she never pretended otherwise. I felt the breath catch in my chest. "Does Caleb know?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not the truth. He knows he was loved, but not by who." The implications of that settled heavy on my shoulders. I had missed his first words, his first steps, his scraped knees and school plays. I hadn't been there to teach him how to tie a tie or throw a baseball, or tell him that the world, cruel as it may be, can still hold space for love. All those years are stolen by silence and fear, by my own inability to face what I'd become. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch long after the sun had set, watching the wind play through the trees as if it carried voices from a time I barely remembered. In my hand, I held the photo again. Anna and Caleb, her arms around him, her smile soft but distant. I imagined what she must have felt, raising him with the weight of my absence, always pressing on her back, the unspoken question in his eyes each time he asked about his father. I told myself that staying away had been an act of mercy, that I'd protected her and him from the broken thing I had become. But in truth, I had only protected myself from guilt, from rejection, from having to look my choices in the eye and take responsibility for the wreckage they left behind. The next morning, Mary handed me a small, worn box. Inside was a pocket knife I'd given Anna on her 19th birthday, engraved with the initials J.H., back when those letters still meant something good. Beneath it was a faded photo of us, barely visible now, taken by the river the summer before I shipped out. We were barefoot, laughing, unaware. I looked at her, unsure what to say. "She never stopped loving you," she said simply, even when we all told her to move on. There was a long pause between us, the kind that says everything that can't be spoken aloud. Finally, I asked, "Do you think I could meet him?" Mary didn't answer with words. She just nodded, and in her eyes I saw the same quiet strength that had lived in Anna, the same belief that it's never too late to tell the truth, even if it comes wrapped in regret. And so, with a heart heavier than any medal I'd ever received, I prepared myself to meet the boy who had every right to hate me, and perhaps in time, to forgive me. The moment I saw her standing at the far end of the cemetery, her figure outlined against the grey light of late afternoon, I felt something inside me tighten with such force that I thought my legs might give way beneath me, because it wasn't just that I recognized her. It was that, despite all the years, despite the distance I had tried to place between myself and the past, she stood there as deep. Oh, she had been waiting, not with bitterness or even expectation, but with the kind of stillness that only those who have made peace with pain are capable of carrying. Anna was facing a modest headstone, her hands resting on the top of it gently, as if the stone itself required her comfort, and though her back was turned toward me, I knew immediately it was her, not because of the way she stood or the shape of her coat, but because something in the air shifted the moment I saw her, as if the years folded themselves inward, and I was no longer the man who had had a den for so long, but the boy who once held her hand at the edge of the wheat fields in Kansas, thinking foolishly that love was strong enough to outlast the machinery of war. I approached slowly, each step weighted with memory and regret, and when she finally turned, it wasn't with surprise or fear, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had played out this moment in her mind more times than she could count. Her face was older, yes, touched by time and perhaps more sorrow than joy, but her eyes still held that unflinching steadiness that had first drawn me to her, the sense that no matter what storms came, she would not look away. We stood there in silence for what felt like an entire season, and in that space, I saw the whole story stretch between us. The nights she must have spent wondering if I'd been killed or if I had simply chosen not to come back, the letters she wrote and rewrote, the quiet days raising a boy with my eyes and my stubbornness, never speaking my name and yet never quite erasing it either. Finally, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and pulled out the small, folded square of fabric I had carried with me for more than a decade. The lavender ribbon, once vibrant and fragrant, now faded and worn at the edges, but still intact, still hers. And I held it out to her with a hand that shook only slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything this gesture represented. Everything I had failed to say, everything I still hoped might be forgiven. She took it in her hand, without speaking, held it for a moment as though it might crumble in her fingers, and then pressed it to her lips with a tenderness that shattered what little composure I had left. And when she finally looked at me, there were tears in her eyes, not streaming, not dramatic, but quietly resting there like they had been waiting too. "I kept waiting for the letter," she said, her voice soft and even. "Then for the phone call. Then for the knock on the door. Eventually, I stopped expecting any of it, but I never really stopped looking. I wanted to apologize, not just for leaving, but for staying gone, for pretending that silence was protection, that disappearing was the same thing as being noble. But I couldn't find the words, because no amount of remorse could rewrite the time we had lost, and no apology, however heartfelt, could return the years she had spent alone, raising a child who would never know the sound of my voice. "I thought it would be kinder," I said finally, "to stay away." She looked at me then, not with anger, but with that same quiet clarity I remembered from long ago. "Kinder for who?" There was no malice in her voice, only truth, and that truth cut deeper than any accusation could have. We sat together on the stone bench near the grave, her father's, as I had guessed, and watched the sun begin to fall behind the distant trees, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the grass. And after a long pause, she reached into her purse and handed me a photograph. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, sitting on a porch step, a book open in his lap, and a thoughtful look on his face that felt uncannily familiar. "His name is Caleb," she said. "He's bright, sensitive. He asks a lot of questions. He's like you in more ways than I can explain." I stared at the photo, and in the curve of his brow, the angle of his chin, I saw pieces of myself I had never expected to find in another person. And the weight of that realization, the enormity of it, settled over me like snowfall, slow and total and undeniable. "Does he know?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not everything, but enough." There was a long silence between us then, the kind that fills the space between what was and what might still be, and when she finally spoke again, her voice trembled just slightly. "He calls you Mr. Harris. I told him you were someone who used to know me. He asked if you were a good man. I said you were trying to be." I felt something inside me crack open then, not with pain, but with the unfamiliar sensation of hope. And I turned to her, barely able to find my voice. "Do you think he'd want to meet me?" She smiled gently. "I think he already does. I used to think that the past was something you outrun, that if you changed your name, your town, your voice, even the way you walked through the world, you could slip out from under its weight like a man shedding a coat that no longer fits. But what I've learned, slowly, painfully, honestly, is that the past doesn't stay where you leave it, and it doesn't forget the promises you made, even if you pretend they were never spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed my return to Anna's life, and cautiously to Caleb's, I began to understand that redemption doesn't come in a single act, or with some dramatic gesture of apology. It comes quietly, in the small, steady rhythm of showing up, of sitting on a porch with a boy who doesn't know whether to call you sir or dad, of helping with homework even when the math has changed since you learned it, of fixing a broken fence, or warming up soup in silence, of answering questions not with stories of heroism, but with truths that are complicated and incomplete. At first, Caleb watched me the way animals do when they're not sure if you're friend or threat, his eyes sharp, quiet, skeptical. But children, more than anyone, understand instinct, and eventually he let me in, not with hugs or declarations, but with a simple request to join him in stacking firewood, or a question about what it was like in France, or whether I knew how to build a birdhouse. I told him the truth, that I didn't know everything, that I had missed a lot, that I had made choices I couldn't take back. And when I said those things, he nodded, not as someone who fully understood, but as someone willing to listen anyway. The medal no longer lives in the lining of my coat. It rests now in a small wooden box on the bookshelf in Anna's home, next to the ribbon she gave me before I shipped out, and a photo of Caleb that he drew himself in crayon, with stick figure arms and a big, lopsided smile. I used to think that medal was a burden, a symbol of survival when others had not. But now I see it differently. Not as a monument to what I endured, but as a reminder of what I returned for and of who waited for me long after she had every reason to stop. Anna and I don't speak much about the years we lost. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, when the wind moves through the trees and the dishes are drying on the rack, we'll sit together with tea and let the silence stretch. And in that space, something passes between us that feels like forgiveness. Not the kind that wipes away pain, but the kind that makes room for it without turning away. She doesn't ask for more than I can give, and somehow that makes me want to give everything. Caleb still calls me Mr. Harris, but every now and then, when he forgets himself, he'll say Dad by accident, and when he catches it, he looks at me with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. And I just smile, because I know that when he's ready, it won't be an accident anymore. I write now, Not reports or confessions or apologies, but memories. I write so Caleb will know who I was and who I am and what I was too afraid to be for too long. I write so that one day he can read my truth and make peace with it, or question it, or reject it entirely, but at least he will know it came from me and not from someone else's version of what I was supposed to be. The name I carry now, John Harris, is no longer a disguise but a reclamation. It is the name Anna first said in love. The name Mary cried out in shock. The name Caleb speaks in curiosity and, slowly, trust. It is the name I ran from, the name I buried, the name I return to now not as a soldier, not as a ghost, but as a man who chose finally to be seen. And in this life I live now, quieter, slower, fuller, I've come to believe that some things we carry not because they are light, but because they are ours. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we find that even the heaviest things can be shared. We share new stories every day, real tales that move and inspire. If this one touched you the way it did me, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that matter.